that you will gather when you're out on the course. So elevations, tee to green, green speeds, and green surface ratio, all that will be measured for you when you get there. So you won't need to worry about that as a rater. Our measuring team that goes out in advance will gather that information. Some of the other highlights from this little section here. So they should consider the likelihood of obstacles coming into play and the difficulty of recovery when necessary. And when they're saying they're talking about course raters. So course raters should be guided by what will probably happen, not by the extremes of what could happen. And so this is kind of getting back to, if you remember from last week, kind of that shot dispersion chart where we're talking about, we're looking at probability of obstacles or things coming into play and not necessarily thinking about the worst case scenario and what could happen. So we have to think about improbabilities and using probabilities to get an accurate rating. And then when we're out there on the hole, it also says that we should defer final judgment of rating values until we've seen all the features of the hole. And usually we can get all that when we're on the putting green at the very end. So when you're on the tee, you might think, man, the trees on this hole are really, really difficult. But you can't really put down a value for trees until you get to the end of the hole when you can evaluate how that obstacle is for the entire hole. So you won't be putting any numbers down until you actually get to the end of the hole and can fully evaluate everything that we're supposed to be looking for. And then as we're moving throughout the course, we want to make sure that we're relating obstacle ratings for each hole and comparing those to other holes that we did, right? So when we're talking about, difficulty of certain things, whether that could be trees or, well, trees is a good example, just as that's one of the most subjective parts of the rating process. But in trees, we're looking at relative difficulty as well, right? So if we give trees a value of, let's just say 4 on one hole, and then we get to the next hole and trees are definitely more challenging, then that value, needs to reflect that. So that value needs to be higher, or likewise if it's lower. And so we're looking at the relative, ratings for each hole as well, not just on that specific hole and then not thinking about it as we go forward.
We did have some questions pop in the chat here.
Yep.
The first one is, does the USGA recommend blended tees, like an example of a blue-white combo, where the length between the blue and white is over a certain yardage?
Yep. Yeah. So that's a good question. So as part of our service that we provide to golf courses, we can do combo tees, and I don't know if there's a quote unquote formal recommendation from the USGA, but we at the GAM definitely recommend that courses consider using hybrid or combo tees. As basically it's a low cost way for them to add another opportunity or another quote unquote yardage for people to play when they go to the course. So we definitely recommend it. We've seen a lot of that in recent years, and that's something that we can put together with the computer program that we have, and doesn't require us to go out there, or doesn't require us to do the actual rating of a quote unquote combo tee during the rate, because we'll just rate the blue tee and the white tee, and then the computer program will put the mesh together, or the combo together on that.
Yeah, it's a great option. We have 2 more questions. One's quick. Is there a link to last week's webinar? You want to tell them where they can find those, or?
Yeah, if you wanna, you can just grab the link. It should be in that last email we sent out. But if you want to grab that link, Theodore, and throw it in the chat, that'd be great.
Yep. And then the comparison to earlier holes becomes easier as the team progresses on. Pretty hard on the first hole. Would we recommend a post review of, say, trees after a group finishes a set of holes?
Yeah, I think John, I think that's a good idea. I guess I'd like to get other captains' thoughts to see if that might be, or how, or what they do in those scenarios, and open it up to someone that might want to comment on that.
That's it for questions right now. Thanks, Kyle.
I think that, I mean, we as a group discuss trees at the end of each hole as we gather at the green. And then as we go through, you know, the 9 holes or whatever, we talk afterwards. You know, when we go in to do our numbers, we'll rediscuss sometimes numbers on various holes. And trees tends to be one of those that we discuss. And then after we play the course, a lot of times we have discussion again about things such as trees. So some of these things that tend to be a little bit more subjective, I think we have multiple opportunities to address those as time goes on throughout the rate. I mean, that's how we do it anyway, so.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that, Lori. 100%. I think trees is something that we definitely try to get some consensus at the end of each hole. And you know, since we're talking about it at each hole, we can kind of adjust as needed. But I mean, I think John, to your question, if we're ever in a situation where we think like 3 holes in, like maybe we didn't, you know, our previous evaluations might be over or under, then I think that's something at that point where, you know, you can talk amongst the group and say, you know, maybe we need to adjust, or maybe it's something that's done after the fact and said, okay, well, maybe we need to go down on this one and up on this hole. So I think that's definitely worth looking into.
Kyle, one thing I would point out in support of what John's saying, though, is every other thing that, you know, we're looking at is easily, I mean, bunker depth and topography and all those things are common among all golf courses, and you're really comparing. But trees, I mean, the danger is to compare the trees to that particular course's trees when everything else, I mean, that's why we've talked before about a standard of, if 4 is average, what does that look like? You know, on a golf course, on golf courses across the country, not on this particular golf course. Because if you're on a golf course that hardly has any trees at all, and if they are, they're a zillion yards away from in play, you're never ever going to get to average, as opposed to saying, well, that's average on this course. Well, that's irrelevant if you're trying to match a course rating so it carries from course to course, to state to country to country. You know, that's what's difficult about trees, I think, is because you have to figure out what is average when it comes to the trees on a particular hole, and what does that look like?
That's a good point. I mean, we don't want to say, like you said, this is average for this course, but average at that course might be a 2, you know? So I think that's where it comes in, you know, to the more extensive or experienced raters and the captains to help guide that, especially to the newer raters.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I agree with that. And Mark, that's a great comment on trees and how it you know, it can be challenging. So yeah, it's something like Lori said, that your more experienced people that have done lots of courses will have a better understanding than most. But that, like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that that there's this complete understanding, because we're dealing with courses across the state, courses across the country, courses across the world with the course rating system. So it's definitely a challenge. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer for you on what is average, but if I figure it out, I'll definitely let you know. All right, a few other things here from section 6. So an experienced, efficient rating team should take about 4 hours to rate an average 18-hole golf course. So for those of you that haven't done this before, we typically do 9 holes at a time. We typically have enough people to do 9 holes. There are some cases where we will do 18 holes, depending on if we have enough people or the golf course. And but when we do a quote unquote average golf course, if we're doing 9 holes, it should take us about 2 hours, maybe a tad bit more. But we're always wanting to make sure that we're doing our work at the pace of play, because kind of how that process works is that we're basically, we're just given a slate of tee times at the golf course when we go out there, and we work within play. There's play out in front of us, there's play behind us, and so we need to make sure that we're not taking forever out there and moving along, so we're not slowing up play for the golf course that day. And then one of the best parts about rating, I think most people will agree, is that we do typically have the opportunity to play. And so it is highly recommended that the team play after to gain insight. And then after playing the course, the team may decide to modify some of the ratings based on their trip around the golf course. Sometimes when you're rating it, you might not, you might miss something really simple, and that you just run into later. Most of the times, and I think Lori mentioned another scenario where you look at trees and you might adjust trees or something like that after the fact. Typically we're talking about moderate adjustments or minor adjustments that happen after. And really, from the GAM's perspective, I would say that, don't necessarily see the playing part as part of the job. We want it to be fun, and we want you to have fun when you're playing. But if you do run into something or realize something, definitely point it out to the captain so that they can address it. And if we do need to make an adjustment, we'll make an adjustment. And so, I know it's not hard, or it's not easy for a lot of us to turn off our rating brain when we're playing. But again, we do want it to be fun, and don't feel like when you're out there playing after that you're quote unquote on the clock. If you notice something, great. If not, it's not a huge deal, because like I said, most of the adjustments and I can't speak to everyone, but based on my experience, most of the adjustments that we've made have been minor in nature.
Kyle, I think sometimes when that happens, it's, we'll be doing the rate and we'll have a question as far as, well, how much of an obstruction is that tree going to be, or something like that, or a dog leg if it can be carried. Sometimes there's just things until you get out there and actually play the hole. You recognize that it's an issue when you're rating it, so you want to take a second look at it when you go out and rate. And I've had numerous people come up to me after rates, it's we're heading, or even while we're out on the course, and say, hey, that hole that we were talking about, we took another look at it and this is what we were thinking, please, or make an adjustment on my sheet about such and such. And so, we want to definitely have fun. We want to enjoy the course and play and enjoy the day. But, sometimes you'll just make a little note on your scorecard as you go out. Okay, remember to take a look at such and such, on a hole. So.
Great. Oops. All right, next, so jump around a little bit here. We kind of had this in the last ones, but we kind of jumped over it. But section 4, once we get into obstacles and effective length corrections here, just a couple kind of basic things. We're evaluating separately for both the scratch and bogey player obstacles, and there's one minor exception that we'll talk about when we talk about trees at a later session. And then when a bogey player cannot reach a par 3 hole in one shot, we rate the hole as a 2-shot hole, but there is no fairway value. So you'll see that under Form 1 that you won't be able to put a fairway value for that. And we'll actually talk about that in a future session about a hole that might be listed as a par 3, but because of actually maybe we'll talk about it today, because of a effective playing length correction, it turns into a par 4, and how to handle that. Someone remind me to talk about that if I don't bring it up when we're talking about dog legs and Form 1s. Theodore, that's on you. All right, thanks. And then when we're looking at 10 obstacle factors in addition to our effective playing length corrections, and each one is going to be evaluated on a scale of 0 to 10. And then under each of our obstacles and under some of the things we'll talk about today, we'll have these adjustments, and we apply the adjustments in the order that they're listed on the page. And so you'll see an example of that when we talk about roll here in a little bit. And these adjustments, again, we're applying them in the order that they're listed on the page. And then if you see an asterisk, this thing here, if you see that next to one, that means that they're shot specific. Okay, and then under a couple of the obstacles, R&R or recoverability and rough, and then bunkers, shot specific adjustments are cumulative, which means that you could have two adjustments if it happens on 2 distinct shots. So in your guide, and most of you that have done this know, but in the back of the guide, there is a list of all the adjustments, and then what obstacle or effective playing length they fall under. And that's listed here on the right. So if you're ever not sure that you need to look at it in multiple places, you can always use that in the back of the book as a reference to make sure you've covered everything. Oops. All right, so we're going to move on to our effective playing length corrections. So when we talk about these things, we're really, there are going to be certain things on this list here that we don't deal with. So we don't deal with altitude in Michigan because it needs to be over 2,000 feet of elevation for that to kick in. And then we don't necessarily deal with wind out on the golf course. We'll talk about how we handle that at the GAM. And then much of the elevation is already pre-measured for us, but there are ones that we might have to, guess at or estimate. But really, when we talk about these effective playing length corrections, they're very important. Any time that we're impacting the yardage of the golf course, that's extremely important to the rating and the slope rating. So when we look at the whole process and how all that information is calculated, distance is the most significant factor by a long shot. And I believe it's 70+%. Gene or someone can correct me if that's not accurate, but it is significant. And so when we make these corrections for roll and dog leg and forced layups, we need to make sure that we're doing them right and we're making the proper adjustments on the sheet, because if we do them incorrectly, it can have a huge impact on the actual outcome of the rating. and we'll walk through some examples on a Form 1 on how what's the proper way to handle that. So for roll, roll is evaluated on full tee shots and then any subsequent full shots for both the scratch and bogey player. So again, it's only on full shots. If we're hitting less than a full shot, there won't be any roll adjustment, just only full shots. Some factors that affect roll include the fairway slope or tilt. The example here, a ball hit to a downhill landing zone rolls farther than one hit into an upslope. Fairway firmness. Soft fairways will result in less roll than firm fairways. For fairway firmness, again, this is kind of one of those things that we need to think about where Michigan is in the grand scheme of things. For us, we're not really dealing with a ton of this fairway firmness. Whereas, if you go over to the UK or somewhere where you have a lot of link style courses that the ground is definitely harder and firmer and the golf course is meant to be played a little differently, that's kind of where this whole firmness will come into play. We don't really have a ton of scenarios where we're really looking into the quote unquote firmness of the fairway. Another example here in the States would be like a Pinehurst golf course where the golf course is kind of designed to be played more on the ground than in the air. So we don't have a ton of these kind of fairway firmness evaluations. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but there's not that many. And then we also will factor in landing zones that are not cut to fairway height. So oftentimes, and you'll run into this with bogey players a lot, where their landing zone starts in the rough and doesn't quite get to the fairway. Well, obviously that ball is not going to roll this far. And so there might need to be an adjustment that needs to be made for that golfer.
Kyle, we have a question popped up. Would firmness be related to watering of fairways or grass height or anything of those sorts?
So I guess it could be. I think I'll kind of open it up to the captains and the more experienced people than myself. But the only course that I can think of off the top of my head that I think we might have had some firmness was the new course or the South course at Arcadia Bluffs. That's the only one I recall seeing, but other captains might have other examples here in Michigan, or might be able to answer that question better than me.
So Kyle, this is Mark. Keep in mind that it's not firmness or softness on the day of the rate, but it's on average over a 10-year period. So we're not specifically looking at firmness and softness as it applies to most courses, because on average, throughout 3,000 days of opportunities to play golf, the course will have a variety of hardnesses, firmnesses, and softnesses. So generally, we don't get into that. We just typically say average roll. But like you say, there is Arcadia South. We had some. The loop is meant to be fescue grass and very firm. And really, those are the couple of them that we've used firmness in terms of roll on.
Yeah, Mark, that's a great point. Yeah, we don't want to, and I think that kind of applies to a lot of things. We don't want to be biased by a one-time experience. Whether it's course conditions, how thick certain areas of the course. And that's why a lot of times we'll talk to the golf course pro to get an idea of what these normal playing conditions are, or in some cases we may have what the system or what the USGA calls a narrator. That's someone that goes out with us that can provide some of that insight, who is that at that golf course on a yearly basis and knows what the typical playing conditions are like. And so having a narrator in that scenario can definitely be helpful.
Kyle, as far as roll goes, I don't recall making adjustments for firmness on roll. I mean, we could have over the years. I don't recall ever doing it. Her question about, lack of watering and that type of thing, I think sometimes that comes into play more in the under rough and recovery. Courses that don't have the money, maybe some public courses that don't water their rough, and so their rough is really short and scrawny. And I think that comes more into play in that area more so than on the fairway, where we'd be adjusting for roll.
Okay. All right, good questions, and discussion on this. So the other thing too, when we're talking about roll, and this is something that I'll have a picture here on the next slide that will kind of make it a little easier to understand. But full shots will roll between 15 and 25 yards with a 20-yard average. So we're not going to be making any adjustments. Here, I'm going to go to this page. We can come back to that. We're not going to be making any adjustments to roll if it doesn't go, more than 10 yards, or, I guess the one way to think is that we're not going to make any adjustments unless it goes more than 10 yards off of that average of 20. So you can kind of see that when our ball is here, we're expecting it to be somewhere in this 15 to 25 range on rollout. And if it's not, if it goes beyond that, or if it's in front of that, then that's when we make the adjustment. So, there is a built-in buffer. So we're not necessarily making a roll adjustment if it's just going to make the ball roll out 15 yards instead of the normal 20. And so you can see as you go to the left here, a plus roll rating is going to add yards to the effective playing length. And as you go to the right, a negative roll rating is going to subtract yards from the length of the hole. So when we're writing down the number, negatives and positives definitely matter. And we want to make sure that when we put a negative number down, we're thinking that, okay, minus means that it's subtracting yardage from the hole. A plus number means that it's adding yardage to the hole. And so each kind of point, or 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, is worth 5 yards. But again, keep in mind that we do have that expected 10-yard buffer where it could roll 5 yards less or 5 yards more. So it needs to go beyond that in order for us to make an adjustment. And when we get to our extremes, when our threes and our so if we take this as the left side as an example, if we talk about a +3, we're getting at a golf shot that literally does not go anywhere. And in order to be a +4, the ball would actually have to go backwards, roll backwards, hit and roll backwards. Definitely possible if you hit into a really, really deep up, or steep upslope, but typically doesn't happen a lot.
Kyle, I have a quick
Yeah.
question.
Yep.
In the event of a ±1, do those 5 yards, when the approach shot length is adjusted by 5 yards in terms of effective playing length, does that affect the rating very much, or at all?
Yeah, so I guess it would just depend on how many times it happens. I mean, obviously, ±5 yards on 18 holes would definitely have a huge impact. And typically, which we'll show in a little bit on the actual Form 1, you'll see typically when you adjust that approach shot length, typically adding 5 yards doesn't necessarily move it into a different green target column. But there are cases if you're at the end that it could. So I guess to answer your question, I would say more often than not, it probably does not have a major impact. But there are some cases where it could.
This is Bob Carter. I have a comment.
Sure.
If I put down a -2, in the past, I've always considered that adding 10 yards to the 20 and subtracting 10 yards from the approach shot. On this chart, it looks like I should be subtracting adding 15 yards if I do it a -2. I've never heard that discussed that way before. I've always referenced the 20 yards, period, and not the slop in the system. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good Mark. Do you want to?
Sure. The effective playing length differential, when you put down a +2, you're making the hole play a little longer. So a +2 is that factor. The adjustment then to the approach shot would be an adjustment of 10 yards more. So if the approach shot was 150, based on the average roll of 20 yards, and you're saying you're putting a +2 on roll, that then becomes 160 yards, and you're adjusting the approach shot with 10 additional yards. Does that clarify that, Bob?
Hey, Mark, this is John, or Bob, this is John. I think
it looks like on this chart, Mark and Kyle, if I put down a +2, they're saying that I'm backing it up 15 yards from the 20. I don't think I've never done that way before. I always reference the 20-yard average.
Gotcha. And I think that's the correct way to do it. But to do the +2, you've got to determine that the ball is only going to roll a total of about 5 yards, because you're still on the chart if it rolls between 15 and 25. You're not making any adjustment if you're rolling between 15 and 25. So if you're determining that the ball will only roll about 5 yards forward rather than the 15 to get on the chart, or the average of 20, that's when you apply the +2 opportunity. If you apply a +3, that's just as Kyle said a second ago, you're assuming that there is no roll if you're going +3. And if you're doing +4, you're actually saying that the ball is rolling backwards. So I think the math still works out that the average is 20, and that's the number that you're using as the typical average roll that's put into the approach shot length on the Form 1. To get off that roll list, as I say, to do a +1, you'd think the ball would only be rolling 10 yards, not 20 on average, which is 5 less than the 15 for the minimum application. And a +2, then the ball would only be rolling about 5 yards in terms of that math. Does that add any clarity?
No. Kyle, where does this chart come from?
So this is a chart that I put together and share with the USGA, and I mean, so basically what Mark is saying is correct in that the don't necessarily look at the yardages at the top. So basically, anytime if you put on your sheet when you're putting 1, 2, 3, or 4, those are going to be when you adjust the approach shot length, those are going to be in increments of 5 yards for each point. But in order to have that adjustment, you're not necessarily basing it off of 20, you're basing it off of this 25 and 15, because we're assuming that there is a wiggle room, and that if your ball rolls out 15 yards instead of 20, there is no adjustment made. And likewise, if it goes 5 yards further, there's no adjustment made. It's only an adjustment when it goes at least 10 yards more or 10 yards less. But the actual yardage adjustment that you made, that you've done correctly, is 5 yards for each one of these numbers at the bottom.
Yeah, I thought, this is John, I thought I understood this initially, Kyle, and as I've thought about Bob's question, I am a little more confused with this chart, because I think what we're saying is the chart initially says, if we don't look at the plus and minus, the chart is initially saying on average, a shot is going to roll 20 yards. And what we're attempting to do with the adjustment is we're saying on average, is the shot going to roll less or more than 20 yards? If on average the shot rolls less than 20 yards, say by 5, so we're on average 15, it should be a +1 adjustment. So when I get to that line down below, it's not saying that. It's saying
that's not correct though. So in order for there to be an adjustment, it needs to go more than 10 yards from that 20, because the system is saying that on average it rolls 20. Sometimes it's 15, sometimes it's 20. And so for us to actually have an adjustment, we need to assume, or it needs to be more than 10 yards, or at least 10 yards.
okay, so the average has to be less than 10 or more than 10 in order for us to make the first adjustment. And then after that first adjustment, each incremental average after that becomes an additional plus or minus.
Correct. And then when we put the +1 on the sheet, we are only making a correction on the approach shot length of 5 yards, but we're doing that because we're assuming that there's that 15 to 25 yard window, and not necessarily off of the average.
Kyle, essentially, it's smart. So essentially, what we're trying to understand here then is, and I understand that between 15 and 25, you do nothing.
Exactly.
And so it's really only to the extent that it falls outside of that 15 to 25 range. We've always talked about 20, and that's how we, that's where the measurement, the whole length is measured from. But anything outside the 15 to 25, that's where you get a +1 or +2, depending on how far it is outside that do nothing range.
Right.
And you don't worry about its relationship to 20 per se. It's how far it is outside of the do nothing range.
Yep, that makes sense. And
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yep. So maybe you could do a little line on your chart here, Kyle, and say do nothing in that area.
Yeah, right. Add it in there. I like it. All right.
I'm still really confused. I have never done it this way. So what I'm saying is, if I put down a +2, I'm backing it up 10 yards from the average.
That's correct.
But you have that as +1.
No, because so
That's what it says on the chart. If I add 10 yards, I put a +1. So I did hear somebody say earlier that you should never put a ±1 because 5 yards doesn't make any difference. I get that. But if I back it up 10 or I make it forward 10, I should put a plus or a -2. Somebody earlier said never put a plus or -1. That's what this chart tells me. I should never put a plus or -1. But if I move it forward 10 yards, that should be a +2 to me, or a -2 to me. How does everybody else do this? Or have they done it in the past?
I've always asked Mark when I'm with Mark, but I think Bob, what the way I'm rationalizing this is, each shot will have a probable outcome. On average, it's 20 here, but it could easily be 15. So when you say you're backing up 10, so it should be a +2, you're really saying I'm referencing the average, but in reality, the shot that we're evaluating is somewhere between 15 and 25. That's the landing zone. That's the probable landing zone. So what Kyle's trying to do is calibrate us to the fact that if we're going to make an adjustment, it needs to be considering that entire that entire zone, 15 to 25. So if we're dropping short, then we need to be back in that area of 10 yards from 20 or 5 yards from 15, which is a possible outcome. So that's why he's saying we're making the +1 at 10 off the average of 20.
I've always adjusted from the average.
Yeah, I have always interpreted
You're
that way
telling
too.
me, I just don't get it. I would like to know the reference manual that this chart came out of before I start doing anything differently.
All right. Well, I think what we'll do is Bob, we can spend some more time on this later or put something together. But I mean, there's obviously some confusion, and I'll be honest with you. Like when I first started, I did this wrong and I didn't understand it. So I mean, it's I think when you're putting the number down, when 1, 2, 3, or 4, those are in increments of 5. So what you've been doing to adjust the approach shot length is correct. It's just the starting point of how to get to that number is where, like when I figured this out, that's where I was confused. But the 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are in increments of 5. So you've been doing that correctly.
But if you say if I put down a +1, I'm backing it up 10 yards from the 20. Is that what you're telling me I should do?
When you if you put a +1 on the sheet, you want
to. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kyle.
I say if you put a +1 on the sheet, you will want to subtract add 5 yards to the approach shot length.
5 yards from where?
All right, so let's just go to an example here. Let's forget about this and just go into an actual example. So if I have, and this is a Form 1 for those of you that aren't familiar with that. So if I go in and I have on my roll sheet, I have +1 here. All right, so if I have +1, that means the hole is playing longer. So I'm making this adjustment here to my approach shot and changing it to 181, 5 yards more.
So what you're telling me from that is that you're taking that from the average of 20 yards, because that shot length, approach shot length, is figured from the median of that area. So if I put a +1, I'm going to add 5 yards to that, not 5 yards from the back up to the 15. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I understand where you're coming from, because like I said, when like a year ago I was in the same boat. I had the same exact thought process. And again, it's more, I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in it, because I think it's a higher level issue to that. I mean, really what we want to get out of this is just for people to know that pluses add yardages and minuses subtract. And we can talk more offline about it, but I mean, I get where you're coming from, because the first couple of years I did this, I thought the exact same way.
So if I can just wrap this up, Bob Carter.
Yes, sir.
In the over 100 Form 1s that I've seen of yours over the past 20 something years, you've done every one of the roll adjustments perfectly. So don't change anything that you're doing.
Okay, I won't. But I do have a question about roll. On any given shot, I can put a ±4 and then an F ± and a 2 ±. So any given shot, I can only adjust 30 yards, correct?
I would say not any given shot. Kyle, you might want to come in here, but it's a tee shot that has the chart. Tee shot roll is the chart on
Oh,
page 13.
I'm sorry, on any given hole, I can only adjust it 30 yards.
There's a maximum.
Maximum 30 yards plus or minus. Is that correct?
30 yards, which is 4 on the extreme, and then a subsequent shot of a 2 plus, and an F plus.
Right,
So
right.
you would have a total of 6 units times 5 is 30. So yes, 30 is the absolute maximum. I don't think we've ever had anything that's come close to that.
And that's on a hole, correct?
That's on the entire hole, yes.
Right, okay.
So plus or minus 6 maximizes roll.
Got
And
it.
then the shot length adjustment, adjusted shot length, approach shot length, that is to say, would then be adjusted by the 30 yards, either
Right.
plus longer or shorter.
Right.
Okay.
And then Mark, you mentioned this as well, but that plus there, that 6 would come with those 2 adjustments that you talked about, the 2 adjustment and the firm adjustment. So without
Right.
those adjustments, the highest value is a 4.
And without the adjustments, the highest value is a 4.
Right.
We hardly ever use 4. We hardly ever use, well, we do use 3 on occasion, but to get into those extremes of 4, 5, and 6, that's a real rare event.
Yep.
Kyle,
Yes.
Phil Homeblade.
Hey, Phil.
Going back to your other chart, looking at that, your 0 point is where the ball lands, correct?
No. Oh, hold on. Let me.
Yes, it is. It's where your ball lands. You get 15 to 25 yard rollout. So if your ball
Correct.
0
Yep.
and it rolls out to 15 or 25, average being 20. So if you're, like you were saying earlier, if your ball lands and doesn't go anywhere, that's that value's adjustment. If it only goes 5 yards, now you've got your next 5 yard adjustment. So I think in looking at it, we have to look at it from the point of where does the ball land and where does it go from there? If it goes backwards, like you were saying, you're going to get a higher plus value. And if it rolls out 30 yards, well, now you've got another adjustment in the other direction. So really, 0 point is the point in which the ball lands. And then you figure out from there, how much have you gained or lost from that point?
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense to me.
I will say though that, okay, say you have say you lose 20 yards on your tee shot, and then on a subsequent shot, you gain the same amount, which equals nothing. Okay, it equals out to 0. I prefer raters show those things on their Form 1. I mean, put the -2 +2 on there, with the 2 application, because I just want to make sure people haven't missed things. I just like to see that, because I might know, they're off the tee shot, they lost 2 yards. Oh, gee, they didn't put that on their form. But then if it shows that later that adjusted back, then you know that. So it's nice to have everything put on the form. More information is better than no information, because then you know that people haven't just missed it.
Hey, Kyle. Kyle,
Yeah.
it's Mike Lee. Just to clarify, keeping the simple mind here, we've been told ignore the first 5 yards. It seems like what this is telling us that the ignore the first 5 yards is built into it. So instead of like ignoring the 5 yards and never put a 1 on, what we're doing is saying, don't even think about a roll until it's 10 yards one way or the other, and then start with the minuses, which equal 5 yards each. Is that correct?
That's exactly the right way to understand it. Yep.
I agree, because if we were supposed to ignore +1s and -1s, it wouldn't be in the chart. It wouldn't be an option. And so I think exactly what I love the way Phil has described this.
Me too. I think that's
It,
perfect.
It makes it, the math works out perfectly if you just understand it that way. So thanks for that clarification, Phil.
All right, so I just want to go through, I know we're up against our time here. I wanted to spend a few minutes just to go through a couple examples on the Form 1. And we'll talk about that example that Lori mentioned as well, where you have a plus and a minus on the same hole. So again, when we're looking at roll, we're only looking at full shots. So if there's a layup or anything like that, we're not going to do it. But here's an example where we had a +1. We're going to adjust 5 yards up. If we have a -2, let's say here for our bogey, then we're going to, because we're minus, we're subtracting. So we're going to take this 56 and make it a 46. And then when we do this, we also need to double check this green target number to make sure that that's changed. So if someone has their book and they can just double check these to see if 181 or 46 changes the green target number for 24 effective green diameter, let me know, that'd be great.
Yes, it does.
All right, which one changes, Lori?
I just checked the bogey women, if you go from it's 50 to 64. So if you drop down to 46, it's a different number. It goes from a 5 to a 4.
Laurie, this is a men's Form 1.
Yep.
Oh, it's the men's? Okay, sorry. What was it, 50 to 46? Oh, no, so the men's it would not.
So we don't have any adjustments.
181 to 176.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, on the men's scratch it would, because 181 is a 4 and 176 is a 3.
No, they're both 5s.
All right, thanks, Gene. All right, so in this,
Oh, I'm looking at green diameter. Wait, oh. Okay. I guess it would depend on the green diameter.
right, yeah, 24.
Okay.
So in this
Yeah.
case here, we don't.
Sorry.
No worries. In this case, we don't have any changes, so we would go forward. We might have, as Lori mentioned, we might have a scenario where we have a longer hole. So as par 5 as first one would be a good example. Let me just clear this really quick. So on our par 5, we might have 2 shots. This one we don't, but let's just assume we have 2 shots. So on our first shot, we might have +2 for our number. But then on the next one, we might hit a downslope and it might be a -2. And so what Lori was saying is that these would cancel out, but it's helpful for the captain to potentially have both of those, or if you want to put a note down at the bottom to say that, roll was, oops, down here with the notes part, where the notes are, to say that roll was, roll on tee shot was plus, roll on minus was negative, so that the captain knows that value came out to 0. But at the end of the day, that value is going to be 0 on the sheet if we have 2 adjustments on one hole that cancel each other out. Or we might have a +2 and a -1, and then that would work out to a +1 for roll. And then our approach shot length would be a +5 in that case. All right. Is there any questions before? I know we're at our end of our time here. Are there any final questions about what we covered today? in terms of role, we'll definitely send some more information so to clear up some of the confusion that there is around this. Nope.
Good job, Kyle.
All right. Well, appreciate everyone taking their time. We will definitely get to dog legs, forced layups next week, and then start on the obstacles. And then if anyone has any questions, we'll stick around here if anyone wants to talk more. But appreciate everyone's time, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yep.
Thanks, Kyle.
Bye, Kyle.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Kyle.
Thanks, everyone.
We did have something come in last minute. I don't know if Ron is still on
Yeah.
here or not, but are you seeing that?
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. All right. So how are the obstacles typically discussed? Yeah. So to answer that question, then is Ron? Theodore? Can you confirm?
I'm
that?
looking, yeah. Yeah, he's still on here. He should be hearing us.
Yeah. So kind of how we typically discuss is that typically at the end we will at the end of each hole we'll gather near on the green. And then that's typically when we discuss the obstacles. You might be in the fairway or in the landing zone as well, and someone might notice that, hey, we've got this adjustment that needs to get made, and that would be another scenario where we would talk. But typically, most of the discussion happens at the green at the very end once we're done looking at everything on the hole, and then. So when you go out there, it's a good question too, especially for someone that's new. So when you go out there, you're going to be assigned to a specific tee. So if you can see on the page here, like this rater will have the blue tee for men, and they'll be looking at that. And then you'll be on one tee, and then I'll be on the white tee, and Theodore will be on the red tee or whatever. And then obviously for newer people, we'll team you up with someone. But yeah, so everyone will kind of be on their own tee and looking at it from that singular point of view.
I guess my question about the trees was, if you're not thinking numerically, what are you talking about in regards to trees?
Yeah, so basically when we're looking at trees, we're looking at a level of difficulty. So we're looking at a minor problem, moderate problem, significant problem, and an extreme problem. And those are kind of our 4 starting points. And then from there, that's how we get to our numbers. But those are kind of our starting points from our chart.
So is it height of tree, density of tree, number of trees?
There's lots of things that go into it. It's number. It's to go for exactly. It's number, height, density, distance, the length of shot. If it's easy to recover from, there's lots of things that go into that evaluation. So I think trees are probably one of the harder things to rate, in my opinion, just because there is so much subjectivity in that in the evaluation.
Okay. And obviously I'm new, but is the role, has that changed with the change in drivers, higher fight and shorter roll?
So that they have not changed that number. The USGA has not, and they basically what they did to get to that number was they used to gather average distances of to get to their scratch players. They used the US Amateur essentially, and that's where they gathered most of their data. And then for other I forget exactly how they got the bogey data, but it was from some subset where they had a lot of data. And what, you know, when a lot of times when we think about like a scratch player, we typically think about like a pro, but really, you know, the pro is not necessarily a scratch player. They're like a plus like 6 or 7 or 8. So we're really talking more about like for us, like a plus player is probably like a good high school golfer. And when I say good, like not in the top 20 of the state. So like a good to better than average high school golfer is really what a scratch golfer is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Looking forward to Wednesdays.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know it was a lot here, and there's a lot of things that I know when I first started too, a lot of this is just kind of over my head, and really, you know, what you'll find out, and for any of the new people that are still on, I mean, really the most important part about rating is to know to get the number from the chart and get it on the sheet, and all these little things that we're talking about, these adjustments. I mean, you know, if you'll just pick up more and more of them as you go on, and you'll go from getting 50% to 50% of them right to 60 to 70, and then, you know, you'll probably, most people never get to 100. We don't have that many people that know it all, so it's just getting in the ballpark is important.
Okay. All right, I think that's it.
All right, thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Ron.